Good evening, welcome. Please take your seats. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Sebastian Burka. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Council. We're thrilled to welcome Adam Szyminski and Ed Crooks to our platform tonight for the third program in our Food, Fuel, and Finance series. I would like to thank the CME Group for their continued support of this important series at the Council. This event is on the record, and we are live streaming, so feel free to use social media, but please remember to silence your phones. We'll take questions from the room and from online. The link to the app is currently displayed on the screens, and for those of you watching online, please type chi.cnf.io directly into your browser and select today's program. You can ask a question and vote on questions. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The Council is a membership organization, as you may know. If you're a member, thank you for your support. It allows us to continue to produce affordable, accessible, and independent content. If not, I hope you will consider joining. Our memberships start at $100. We have several exciting events coming up. On June 7th through 9th, our annual Chicago Forum on Global Cities will be happening. This is our flagship event, and if you haven't registered, please do. We still have some spots available. On June 13th, we'll host a discussion on North Korea, always in the news lately. And on June 21st, an analysis on future growth markets across the globe. We have many other exciting programs coming up, so please check our website. I will return to moderate the Q&A, and now I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Leo Melamed, who will introduce our speakers. Mr. Melamed is Chairman and CEO of Melamed & Associates. He is Chairman Emeritus of the CME Group and a valued member of the Council Board of Directors. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Melamed.
Thank you, Sebastian, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and join you in what I think is going to be a very important session. The CME Group, which everyone knows is the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, born here in Chicago, was born in agriculture and food. So this program is the third in the series of showing or reminding us of our history. We started in food, we went to fuel and finance. Today we are mostly finance. We had two sessions, the one on food and the one on finance was held here, and now we're completing the series with one on fuel. And clearly fuel, or shall I say energy, is one of the most important topics in the world, always. I mean, since the time these two gals, or was it guys? I'm not sure, but they invented fire. Since then, fuel, energy has been uppermost in issues, topics, conversation, and actual fact in the world. Our exchange in particular has a long history that relates to fuel because we trade it. And as a result of that, we create a price discovery mechanism for the world to use. People forget that, and they think that it's just a place where a bunch of guys get together and trade. Yeah, that happens, but today it's electronic anyway, and it's all over the world. And the trade we do is the price discovery for the world. At the moment we have a trade between a buyer and a seller, a price is established. Now that price won't be of the same price a moment later because information keeps changing the nature of that price. But a price is what we offer to the world for that moment in time and for the continuous time of the market, a system of value that can be used as an insurance mechanism because we have a price. Sometimes when our price is too high, we get blamed for making that price. You remember a couple of years ago, was it a century ago, when a barrel of gasoline was what, 100, maybe reaching 150, maybe even close to $200 a barrel? Oil, I mean. We were blamed. Our market was blamed because it was the speculators that were causing that price. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Our traders are both sellers and buyers, and the ones that sold at 100 and had to buy it back for 200, they weren't very happy with that, and they weren't the ones that made it happen or made it go to 200. We aren't blamed for the low price today. We did the same thing. Why aren't we at fault that now it's under $50 a barrel, maybe 40, and who knows where it's going? We can't be blamed for that or the other. Our market is an open and free market, and it's probably one of the most important markets in the world. And I don't really mean probably. It is. I'll just end that little bit of introduction before I introduce our speakers with this little story. It just happened on the date that Donald Trump was elected president. And on that date, the market in stock indexes, which we trade to establish prices in stocks, it happened at night, as you recall. Depending on where you were, it was after midnight. But our market was going. We had a market, and it started to fall precipitously. It fell the limit that we allow at night, 5%. By morning, in the opening, it was back to even. And Carl Icahn said to us that we were the only market in the world that was open and liquid, and he could buy at the fall of 5%, he could buy, he said buy, $1 billion worth of stock. Now, good for him, because it turned out to be very right. He's a very good trader, but that's not the point. The point is there was a market of that kind, and it was liquid and live, and it was us. And that's what we provide in all the commodities, all the products we trade, from food to finance to fuel, which brings us here today to hear Adam Semensky, the James Schlesinger Chair of Energy and Geopolitics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and previously served as the administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration. He also served as a Director for Energy and Environment on the National Security Council at the White House, and previously was Chief Energy Economist at Deutsche Bank and earlier Senior Energy Analyst for NatWest Securities. Clearly an expert in energy. Equally clearly is that of Ed Crooks, the U.S. Industry and Energy Editor for Financial Times. He's been covering energy most of his adult life, and previously was editor and news editor of the Financial Times. So without further ado, I introduce you both and offer you you're all wired up.
We're ready to go.
Wired up and ready to go.
The stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Malamet, for that terrific introduction. Thank you very much to the Chicago Council for inviting us here today to talk. I have to say also congratulations to the Chicago Council for picking this day when you may have noticed energy has been somewhat in the news. Back all those months ago, we knew, it has to be said, we just had that kind of sense of June the 1st, I think that's when he's going to announce it. So it was pretty smart of us, I think, back then to plan it in this way.
Before you
yeah.
start on the substance, I want to add my thanks to Leo. Leo, I wish I would have had you at my Senate confirmation hearings for that EIA job, because Senator Bernie Sanders asked me if I had worked at a big bank, and I said, yes, I had. And he said, I think you're a speculator. And and I tried to convince him that I was in research, and then I tried to convince him that the Deutsche Bank, who I had worked for, had financed more renewable energy than any other bank in the world. And whatever I said, he still kept coming back, but you're a speculator. And it was the only vote against me. I really needed you in the room.
Never mind, though, whatever happened to him, right? He was never heard of again. It didn't amount to very much. Anyway, well, as I said, thank you all also very much indeed for coming to listen to us. Of course, we have to address then the question of Paris and President Trump's announcement this afternoon that he's going to be withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. Obviously, it's a big symbolic step, and it's created huge ructions already in business, in the political world, in this country, and all around the world. I wonder what its practical implications are. I was interested, there was a sentence in the president's remarks where he said he described it as a non-binding draconian agreement, which I thought was an interesting kind of, how this is possible to be both simultaneously non-binding and draconian. So question, withdrawing the US from this agreement, what is different as a result? Does anything change in the energy mix, in the energy system in the United States, or indeed anywhere else in the world?
Well, one of the things that President Trump is doing that could make a significant difference in the energy world is in things like opening up federal lands, for example, in Alaska. We've been talking about drilling in Alaska for decades now, and if it was really going to happen in a big way, this is probably the time period over the next year or two that we would see that start. A lot of regulations are being rolled back. And one of the things that the Trump administration has talked about is a clean power plan. And the idea behind the Clean Power Plan was to make utilities pay for carbon dioxide emissions. That would make it economic. That would lead to earlier retirements of coal. And the Energy Information Administration did some calculations saying that over the period between now and 2040, that might actually reduce coal use in the United States by about a third from its current levels. And I don't know that coal's use in the U.S. is going to climb, but without the Clean Power Plan, it could certainly remain flat. Coal's biggest problem, by the way, though, has not been regulations as much as it has been stiff price competition with natural gas and with renewables as those costs have come down, and both federal and state subsidies have stayed very high.
And so in terms of kind of setting energy production in this country, it's more market conditions then, are you saying, and those issues of where the reserves are and how much they cost to extract, rather than anything to do with government regulation that's really determining how those industries rise and fall. Is that fair?
I think it's a combination, so I wouldn't say it's either or, but I think market forces play a bigger role. I think what we may find is that getting things built and permitted is going to be easier. The president said that the permits for Keystone Pipeline should be put on the table, and the approval for the Dakota Access Pipeline, oil pipeline out of the North Dakota area, has also been approved. So things like that can actually happen. So we had a big move in the U.S., certainly over the past decade, towards a lot of recognition of the idea of the environmental movement and keep it in the ground, don't build anything. And I think that at a minimum, the Trump administration wants to change that public attitude and face towards energy development.
And in terms of oil production then, and we were just hearing about oil being down below $50, and that's not the CME's fault. I guess you could say it is in large part the fault of the US shale industry, which has been very successful in increasing production over the past, well, I guess it started roughly at the beginning of this decade, didn't it? But
Right.
the boom in shale oil production really kicked off in 2010 or so. Can US oil production continue to grow then, and will President Trump's policies help it grow faster?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, one of the remarkable things in shale is the combination of horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, what they call multi-stage fracturing, where you are using the sand and water to crack the rocks in kind of smaller areas that are easier to control and therefore improve the productivity of the well. So the rigs are more productive, the wells are more productive, the crews running the rigs are more productive, and the net result is that some companies are becoming more profitable even at $50 or $55 a barrel relative to the disaster that everybody predicted for those companies when oil was 110. One of the things to keep in mind is that in the US, despite the legitimate concerns that people have about water issues associated with hydraulic fracturing, methane emissions, and even seismicity in places like Oklahoma and Ohio, half of the oil production in the US and almost 2/3 of the natural gas production is now coming from hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And so turning the clock back on that is probably not going to happen.
And as you said, it's possible for the industry to continue to grow. So even if prices stay roughly where they are now, you think we will see more drilling, more production growth?
Well, when I go back to my roots in the financial markets, as an oil analyst, one of the things you look at is, return on capital invested. And a lot of the companies are still struggling to show positive returns in the shale area. Yes, some companies, and yes, in some areas, but across the broad spectrum, I think they're still struggling at these price levels, which then makes me think that the possibility of another oil crisis sometime in the 2020s is something that I wouldn't rule out.
And for the moment, then the other thing that's hugely important in the US shale industry, right, is the capital markets. And still now, if you are a US exploration and production company, it seems to be very easy to borrow still. Companies are issuing bonds very freely. You can raise equity very freely as well. And so that's continuing to finance this drilling, even though, as you say, often the returns on it are pretty low.
I think at the very low interest rates we have, there's a lot of money out there looking for a way to make money.
So question, what about the demand for this oil? We've heard a lot of talk recently about peak demand for oil. I think a few years back when prices went to over $100, $150, people talked a lot about peak oil in the sense of peak oil supply and the idea that global supplies of oil were going to be constrained. Now, boot seems to be on the other foot. People think that supply is ample and not something we really need to worry about. But people think that demand will be constrained by various factors, partly by climate policies, by the rest of the world remaining in the Paris Agreement and trying to curb carbon dioxide emissions, and partly by technological change. And Elon Musk and his Teslas, but not just that, obviously, lots of other car companies as well looking at electric vehicles, putting a lot of investment into that. Those electric vehicle costs coming down, becoming increasingly competitive against gasoline-fueled cars. Question, does that mean we're heading towards a peak in demand at some point and in the foreseeable future?
Well, let's first go back to the peak supply idea. And 10 years ago, it was very, very popular. A lot of people were talking about the possibility that we were going to run out of oil or run out of gas. The kind of economics behind that always puzzled me, and I was a skeptic about the idea of peak supply. And the reason is that the way it was talked about is that prices didn't matter and technology didn't matter, that all that mattered was the amount of oil in the ground or the geology, and that once you had produced half of the oil or half of the gas, then you were on an inevitable decline. As a financial analyst, the idea that prices and technology don't matter troubled me. It's like I thought, gee, if prices go high enough and then technology develops, certainly we're going to be able to find other supplies, or we'll reduce the demand, and we're not going to all have to live in caves because we don't have the energy to drive our economy. Peak demand is a little bit different. The idea there is that we are making such tremendous progress in renewables, particularly with solar and wind, that soon the push, and especially after, interestingly, the Paris Agreement was signed, the idea was that fossil fuels have a limited lifespan, that the cost curves are coming down so rapidly on renewables that all of the growth in energy will shortly be coming from solar and wind, and that's what will be powering the economy, and fossil fuels will disappear within a period of 25 or 30 years. I have the same kind of intellectual problem with that idea as I did with others. First of all, right now, renewable energy is mostly electricity, and we do have some ethanol and biodiesel and so on, but it's largely electric driven. Now, electricity is used very heavily in the US and global economies, but we still need a lot of liquid fuels for transportation: cars, trucks, airplanes, trains, ships. We need a lot of coal to make electricity in places like China, where 70 to 80% of the electricity comes from coal. The idea that we're going to easily shunt aside all of these fossil fuels and replace it all with renewables, I can see that we're trending in that direction, but not at a rate that's fast enough to deliver that idea of peak demand.
So what is your expectation then? If you had to bet on it, would you think oil demand will just carry on growing year after year for, decades? How long does this go on?
It depends on the country. In the US, with fuel efficiency standards for automobiles and diesel trucks, we were probably headed down in terms of our oil consumption. But a lot of oil is now being used. One of the slides that was up here ahead of the presentation was how petrochemical use of petroleum is growing very rapidly. If we come back to, well, in the United States and Europe and Japan, yes, you could have peak oil. But are you going to have peak oil in Latin America, in the Middle East, or in Asia? And that's where I'm thinking it's possible at some point out in the future, but probably not in, I won't say my lifetime, be yours, which will probably be longer.
I would say, I hope so, but that would sound rude, so I'm just going to leave that there. So, put those two things together then, what are the implications for prices? So you have, as you say, continued long-term demand growth in emerging economies, certainly, plus, at the moment, abundant supplies and continued growth in US shale and possibly in other parts of the world as well. What does that mean for the market, the global oil market?
When most energy people get together to talk about prices, the one that they really focus in on is oil. It is the oil is the largest source of energy consumption globally, and oil prices tend to often set the pace for what happens in the other fuels. Particularly natural gas. Some humility is called for here. One of the interesting things in looking back at oil price forecasts over the past 50 years is how wrong you can be and how quickly that can happen. So let me just sort of explain two things. And I want to go back to Leo's comments at the very beginning. There's a way to look at the volatility in oil prices using the options markets, and I'm going to come back to that, and we can discuss how the pricing transparency from places like the CME is a really useful analytical tool. But let me just talk about the history of oil prices. If you go back to the 1960s, pretty flat. It was I don't know, the Texas decade. There was plenty of spare production capacity in Texas, and even when there were problems in the Middle East, you turn the valves in Texas and oil would come out of the ground. The decade of the 70s was the OPEC decade, and that's when oil prices ramped up really quickly on the back of geopolitical crises and demand moving up sharply. The 1980s was a decade of give me anything but oil. I want coal, I want nuclear, I want anything. I want conservation and efficiency, but not oil. Price was too high, and then that led to a collapse in the oil price. The decade of the 1990s was another flat one like the 60s. And I kind of think of that as a decade of what's oil? Like what we were interested in the 1990s was the internet, not oil. And the decade of the 2000s, right? That was the decade of China. Growth in Asia was taking off, and we got oil prices taking off with it. Then the 2010s, the decade we're in now, that's the shale decade. So we're back to your shale question. So my kind of historical tour here for you is the idea that oil prices are just going to go along at some lovely level like $55 a barrel for the rest of eternity troubles me. Because I've been there and I've seen it acting very different than that. So now I want to come back to it. So I can tell you, I actually have a very good prediction for you, forecast, actually based on the options market and data from the options market. So in the 1970s, the Black-Scholes algorithm was invented, and the Nobel Prize in economics was actually awarded for Black-Scholes. So the idea was you could take current volatility and you could predict future prices in the options market, and that was like seen as a completely brilliant breakthrough. So at EIA, after they got beat up a number of times for failing to predict that gasoline was going to go up a lot or go down a lot, they said, can we run Black-Scholes backwards and use the options prices out 5 years from now and work backwards to say, what does that imply about volatility right now? So here's what I can tell you. With a 95% confidence level, using the pricing transparency from the CME and all of the people that are in there, it's independent producers and refiners and airlines and trucking companies and farmers, all in those markets along with hedge funds. So it's real. 95% confidence level that the price of oil between now and the end of 2018 will be somewhere between $30 and $95 a barrel. And if it goes above or below that, that's the other 5%. So here's my advice. Everybody needs a plan B.
Well, I think that's been useful. I think justified the price of admission right there with this important market insight. So sometimes though you hear it said that one of the reasons why the price of oil is volatile is because supply and demand are sticky, are slow to respond. So if in any market, you think about the supply and demand equation, if supply and demand respond slowly to a shock, you need a larger price movement in order to get those changes in supply and demand, those changes in quantities. Arguably then, shale changes that a bit because shale is not so inflexible. You can ramp up production reasonably rapidly. We've seen it now in the past, sort of up and down and back up again of the drilling activity and of US production over the past couple of years. Seems to be a lag of about 6 months between the turning point.
More elastic.
Yeah, it's more elastic. So if the quantities are more elastic, does that mean the price will be less volatile for that reason? And does shale kind of act as a buffer in the market and take some of that volatility out of the price? Is that possible?
It is possible. A lot of people, including me, believe that on the way down that shale would act that way, that we could see shale drop off out of the market faster. So what happened though was that the industry, because they wanted the cash flow, got very clever with the crews and the rigs and the properties by concentrating in the best areas of all of that, and they kept production coming to hang on to the cash flow. And I think that kind of got you around from the idea of the elasticity going down. On the upside, I think we're actually seeing it work a little bit more like at least it was supposed to. Shale oil production in the U.S. is probably going to be up 500,000 barrels a day this year, and that again next year. And that's a pretty impressive number given where oil prices are. Now, can I borrow your pen?
Please do. Do you want some?
I'm going to use 2 pens.
Okay.
So here in a place like Chicago, with the University of Chicago, this is very dangerous because I'm going to talk about economics and you talk about elasticity. Every textbook that shows you the supply and demand curves, right, for whatever it is, widgets, there are these shallow little curves, and this is price and this is quantity, and a little change in price gives you a big change in quantity, and that's what, like keeps prices in line. So oil for decades and decades has looked like this. It takes big changes in price to influence either supply or demand. How much less gasoline would you buy if it was $3.50 than $2.50 today? And the answer is probably not a lot. If it went to $5, you'd be thinking a lot harder about cutting back. Well, that's elasticity curves that look like that. That's plagued the oil industry for years, and that's why I think we get those periods that I was describing from the 60s through now of rapid increases in prices and then rapid decreases that are very hard for the industry or OPEC or anybody else to control.
And are we now past that era, or could that era still come back?
Back to your question, are we past that era? A lot of people want to say we are, and what I'm thinking is that we haven't changed those curves enough yet to be able to say that. I think that the 2020s could be another period of disruption in the markets. We've had very little investment in conventional oil. We talk a lot about shale, but there's 70 or 75 million barrels a day of conventional crude oil in the world. And there's been very little investment in that over the past 3 years. And the possibility that that's going to haunt us in the 2020s is of concern.
So where does that leave OPEC? One of the reasons that you sometimes hear OPEC kind of justify its own existence, OPEC countries will say, actually, we are helping the market because of exactly that point about the natural tendency of the oil price to be volatile. We smooth out some of that volatility by managing the market, taking oil off the market. The price is too low, bringing more back on if it's too high. And yet, what we've seen in the past few years is OPEC under enormous amount of pressure, OPEC member countries feeling a great deal of strain from low prices, all kinds of tensions have emerged. Even Saudi Arabia, which you think of as the richest and most financially sound probably of all the OPEC member countries, it has had large budget deficits and so on. Its finances have clearly been under pressure. Does that mean, are we sort of seeing the end of OPEC? I mean, I know
right.
the end of OPEC has often been predicted and has never quite happened yet, but is now OPEC passing?
So one of the things that you asked at the start of your question was, is there a role for OPEC? And so if you're running for office, the answer is absolutely not. It's a cartel, and we don't like cartels, and we want gasoline to be priced low, not higher, because of collusion in the markets. If you go back in history, and this you have to go back into the 1960s, oil prices were very volatile in the period from when oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859 all the way into the early part of the 1900s. Went up and down a lot. Then we had the international oil companies trying to manage the price, and that worked sometimes and didn't work other times. Then the Texas Railroad Commission got into the business in the 1930s because there was too much oil production, and it was considered wasteful to have this actually very valuable commodity being, in a sense, almost thrown away. So the Texas Railroad Commission actually set how much oil could be produced for every well in Texas, and the federal government helped out by passing a law that allowed some of that to move over into Oklahoma and Louisiana and some of the other oil producing states. That was the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. When Texas ran out of spare production capacity in 1972, that's when OPEC came in and tried to do the same thing. So we've had plenty of times throughout the history of the oil industry where companies, the government, whether it was the federal government or the state governments, or an international organization like OPEC, has tried to do something to take that volatility out of the market. Nobody has actually managed to do it as well as the Texas Railroad Commission did for several decades.
Was it that the case then that Texas had an absolute dominant market share globally?
Right.
That's
Exactly.
what helps, right?
And they had the force of law rather than persuasion behind them. So this OPEC meeting, it's who can the Saudis persuade? Can they persuade the Russians to come along? Can they persuade Iran and Iraq to cooperate, even though both countries wanted to see their production ramp up? There was no way to other than through scaring everybody with the idea of very low prices that Saudi Arabia can bring people along.
Yeah, so what do you make of this new, apparently, this new alignment between OPEC producers and some of the leading non-OPEC producers? Back in December, when they agreed their production curbs, we had 11 non-OPEC countries coming along with OPEC: Russia, Mexico, Kazakhstan, various others. And now I see just recently they've been talking about trying to make that a more formal arrangement and a more lasting arrangement. Perhaps not always agreeing on production together, but at least sort of exchanging information and kind of pooling ideas and so on, and making a regular forum for discussion. Is this a new kind of powerful force in world oil markets, do you think?
It's possible. Cartels have a terrible history of success. Market forces.
Sorry, terrible in the sense that it's terrible that they have been successful.
It works for a while and then it doesn't work.
Right.
And ultimately what drives things, I think, is enterprise. Private companies making decisions, capital markets working, and technology driving things like hydraulic fracturing. And ultimately, it's the real underlying cost and supply-demand balances that drive this, and not policy decisions made in Vienna or maybe not even in Washington.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wonder if we should throw it open for questions now. I don't know if you want to come and...
Thank you very much. If you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and please make sure it is a question and not a comment.
Or at least put a question mark at the back of your comment.
Make your comment into a question. We have one all the way in the back, yeah. Victoria, next to you, yes.
So the topic of this is the geopolitics of energy, and you've spent most of the time on oil. There are all sorts of other energies, taking gas out because that kind of goes with oil. So talking about alternative fuels, could you talk more about the future of that?
Sure, Ed should jump in here too. First of all, one of the things that I helped really push at the Energy Information Administration, and I hope everybody in this room signs up for this, is a daily blog that'll be sent out to you in your email called Today in Energy. And what we do in Today in Energy is we want to do exactly what you said. We want to cover all energy, not just oil and gas. And so your question kind of started with a comment, which is, well, why didn't you talk about some of these other things? And the answer is, most of the energy in the world is oil and gas and coal, and it's not renewables yet. It may be at some point in the future. So what we do at EIA is we actually look at what the production is and what the uses are, and we try to make sure that we are covering them at least in some proportion to how they're produced and used. So there are going to be articles on. So renewables, let's talk about renewables. We're making tremendous progress in the costs of wind. We're making a lot of progress in solar. There's still wind in some places is standalone, probably very competitive with natural gas. Solar is not. The only reason that we're still installing solar is because it has federal and state subsidies associated with it. Right now, if the technology changes then we could see that change, and that's what everybody was hoping for. The U.S., I think the numbers in the world is 5% of the world's energy is renewables, and we're headed towards 10 or 15% over the next 20 years. Now, the big argument is how much faster can we grow that relative to the thing? What we need is some kind of a technological breakthrough. We need better solar cells, more efficient conversion of sunlight into electricity, and we need some way to store the electricity. Wind blows mostly at night, the sun shines mostly in the day, and we need some way to store that energy. So the most successful way that we've figured out how to store energy is hydroelectricity. Put water behind a dam, and even sometimes pump water uphill during the night when electricity is relatively inexpensive, and let it come downhill and make electricity during the day when you can sell it for more. And that's true in a lot of places in the US and around the world. We need some kind of improvements in the technology associated with solar to make that really go. It would be tremendously helpful if we had some kind of breakthrough in the nuclear fuel cycle, small modular reactors and other ways of using nuclear fuel. The Three Mile Island nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania is very close to being shut down because they can't compete against natural gas and renewables in the dispatch markets. And if that plant shuts down, that will erase every bit and more of the solar and wind that's been installed in Pennsylvania over the last decade.
The other thing I think it strikes me as very interesting in terms of the geopolitics of renewable energy is the rise of China here. So China is by far the world's largest investor in renewable energy. A lot of the reason that costs of renewable energy have been falling is because of very large-scale manufacturing in China, churning out large volumes of very cheap solar panels, wind turbines, and so on, but particularly solar panels. There's also enormous investment now in batteries and electricity storage going on in China. It's clear that Chinese technology is still some way behind the US and Europe, the kind of where the cutting edge of the technology is. But, as I say, a lot of investment going on, a lot of growth, a very large market, a lot of investment in China, partly for climate change reasons, partly because they have a huge local air pollution problem and they're trying desperately to clean the air in their cities and to cut down on smog. Question, if we were to get to the point where China became really the world leader in renewable energy, and some of these breakthroughs happen, and they happen in China, does that start to have a significant global impact? And is that one of those kind of tipping points in terms of pushing us into some new world and new era of energy?
So a short answer to that question is that's what most of the arguments for keeping the U.S. in the Paris Agreement were based on, is why don't we have a seat at the table to make sure that the U.S. voice is being heard, and that our technology and our companies have a strong role in what a lot of people think is the future. Let's go back to the audience.
Yeah, lots of questions.
We have one over here in the front row, please.
Thanks very much. The advent of shale gas has allowed the United States to be, or at least to contemplate exporting energy for the first time and not being a net importer. And then we have coming up behind it the arrival of solar energy and other renewables. I just wonder, do you think that the United States has now left energy import dependence permanently behind it?
Right. So energy independence has been a goal of every president, I think, going back to Dwight Eisenhower, maybe before that. Sometimes I think of this situation as kind of like the dog that chases cars down the road. What happens if you catch the car? We've talked about energy independence for so long, I'm not sure that anybody has really thought about what it means. Even if we were a net exporter of oil, if something happens in the Middle East and you lose 4 or 5 million barrels a day of oil production, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the price of oil is going to be back to the levels that Leo was talking about earlier, $150 a barrel, and maybe it would be more than that. And we're still going to have, even if we were a net exporter of oil, it would still impact our economy. It could still be a devastating economic development. So we're going to have economic interests. We're going to have interests in stability in the Middle East from a terrorism standpoint. The U.S. interests in the Middle East, I think, go way beyond just the simple idea of whether we're importing our oil or whether somebody else is importing our oil from those regions. So one of the interesting things is, just as a sidelight to this, is we are net exporters of coal. We will, within a year and a half, be net exporters of natural gas, electricity. We're really close. I mean, we buy electricity from Canada and we sell some to Mexico, but we're independent there. And the only we are a net exporter of crude oil, of petroleum products, refined products like gasoline and diesel fuel and petrochemical feedstocks are all going out. So it's only crude oil. And so we're close. And if shale keeps growing, and Ed has asked about that, it's certainly possible. The resources are there. The technology is improving. But we would still have, I think, a really big interest in what's going on in the region. Interestingly, U.S. dependence is going down and China's is going up. And so is the Chinese Navy going to be the one that keeps the sea lanes open in the Middle East Gulf? Really interesting question that we could have another seminar on.
As you say, fascinating. How does the United States feel about that then, as you say, a Chinese battle group, a carrier group in the...
Well, I do know that our military is very concerned about that. They're concerned about the Arctic. They're concerned, and Russian ice-breaking tankers and naval vessels in the Arctic, and they're concerned about China's role in the South China Sea and maybe even in the Indian Ocean. And ultimately, the Chinese dependence on OPEC oil and oil from the Arab Persian Gulf is going to worry the Chinese as much as it did us during the 70s and 80s.
Third, fourth row, please.
What do you think of the decision to drastically reduce the reserves, the U.S. reserves of oil?
Right. The decision to cut the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in half. Good question. There's a lot of controversy about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was actually Henry Kissinger that kind of came up with the idea of a counterbalance to OPEC. So the Strategic Petroleum Reserve goes all the way back to the 1973 Arab embargo and the 1979 Iran-Iraq war. We've had a lot of national security thinkers who have been very concerned about oil vulnerability and how we could deal with that. Another one was Zbigniew Brzezinski, Leo, another Polish immigrant who did well. The idea of the SPR was, if you're dependent on imports, you need to have 90 days tucked away somewhere that you can draw on. And all of the people who belong to the International Energy Agency agreement, so that's most of the countries in Europe, the United States, Canada, now Mexico, Japan, Australia, all agree that having 90 days of oil imports is a really good idea. Well, what about the United States? If we're not going to be importing oil, and that's a possibility, or if we're importing a lot less, maybe we don't need as much oil in the SPR and maybe we should sell it off. The problem that I see is the one that a lot of the economists who do the calculations don't understand. But they sit down and they say, well, we might not need as much in the SPR. Why don't we use that to pay for highways or healthcare provisions or whatever else? It's an easy way to get money in Washington now is to sell oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What a lot of people don't understand is having the SPR there as that safety valve, last-ditch thing that you can rely on has been hugely helpful to politicians to resist doing things that are even worse for the US economy, like putting price controls on because we don't want to see gasoline go to $4, or trying, as we did back in the 1980s, to have supply and demand allocations. We were allocating gasoline around the different stations based on somebody's brilliant idea of how much they needed in, one part of the country or another. And that was a terrible, terrible idea. And the SPR is one easy way for politicians, elected officials, to say, we have the SPR, we can use that in an emergency, let's not do these other things that are counterproductive. And I'm really concerned that taking that option away will come back and haunt us in the next crisis, which I think will eventually come.
Second row.
My question is more the immediate future, based on the fact that planes and ships still use a lot of...
Could you hold that microphone up a little bit?
Sure.
There we go.
Still use a lot of petroleum. So given the fact that the head of the EPA doesn't really believe in climate control, and given the fact that the current president is happy to pull out of the Paris Accord, what do you think are the possibilities of opening up exploration of gasoline in Alaska? And if you did that, what would be the impact on US-Saudi Arabian relations?
That's a long chain of events. But it's the kind of things that, I mean, there's maybe an interesting, and Ed might want to comment on this too. There's always unintended consequences to every decision that you make. And it's certainly possible that one of the unintended consequences of making energy more easily accessible, whether it's Alaska or other federal lands, or allowing pipeline permits to be signed faster, kind of thing, will put further pressure on countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq, who are enormously dependent on oil for their economies. And I think that you're right, that's something that policymakers should probably think about is, well, maybe $35 oil is something that would come out of this. And the Trump administration has said they think they can rebuild the US economy on the back of cheap energy. That's going to be one of the things that's going to spur economic growth. But if the result of that is we destabilize oil producing countries, that could be really bad. And there's, a couple of oil producing countries really close, like Mexico and Canada, that we probably want to think about the kinds of things that we're doing there. What are the implications to the Mexican elections that are coming up shortly? If we have policies that create grave economic problems for Mexico, whether it's tariffs or border walls, that could be a real problem there. It could result in the election of a government in Mexico that could be very anti-US. And thinking about issues like that, I think, is very important. Good question.
And another country that's also close and already in severe crisis, Venezuela.
Venezuela,
yeah, which
right.
could be one. Yeah, I mean, and just wanted to come in on your point then about imports and independence. So the US is much import import dependent than it was, but and what did you use? At the peak, it was importing about 65% of its oil, something like that, I think. It's fallen a lot, but it's still about 30%. So the US is not able to ignore the rest of the world in terms of what happens on the oil market. As you say, Saudi Arabia is still exporting about 1 million barrels per day, I think, of oil to the US.
We get a lot of oil from Canada,
yeah.
A lot of oil from Saudi Arabia. The Mexican oil coming to the US has actually been declining. It used to be a couple of million barrels a day. It's now down to 500,000 barrels a day. And one of the things that we're doing now is almost all of the Mexican crude oil is being refined in the US and sent back to Mexico as petroleum products. And that's one of those global trade issues that I think is very positive for jobs in the economy in the US. And I think we want to be careful that we don't stop that.
We have a question from online. How do recent gas finds in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean change the geopolitics of the region? This was the most voted question, so.
Gas finds
Gas
in
finds.
North Africa,
North Africa.
Israel also, by the way.
Right.
by the
Yeah,
way.
no,
Eastern
it's Eastern Mediterranean.
Oh, Eastern Mediterranean,
yes.
yeah. Changed the politics
Of the region.
of the region. Well,
Or
I mean,
beyond.
it's everybody has believed, and I think that actually you can show statistically that countries that trade with each other a lot have a less tendency to fight with each other. And so there is certainly an opportunity for gas in that area to become a trade issue. Egypt, for example, and Israel. They've got a ways to go. First, they have to get it going. You've got to build pipelines or LNG facilities. All of that is very tricky in the region for lots of historical reasons. I mean, it's not exactly the same situation, but Kuwait, there's gas in Qatar that's just, not that far away that you could build a pipeline right into Kuwait. The Kuwaitis build an LNG plant. They're buying LNG from around the world because they don't want to be dependent on one of their neighbors for supply. It could change it. Let's give Ed a chance while I take a swig of
I was just
water.
going to say, I mean, amazingly, there are countries in the Middle East importing gas from the United States, as you say, because they don't want to buy from their neighbors, and they don't want to be reliant on those pipeline connections. I was talking to the Israeli energy minister about exactly this subject. He was in New York recently and had a chat about it, and the mood music from him, as you say, was don't expect anything imminently then. I mean, clearly with Egypt there is potential there, and there's something that could be
The
done
resource
in
base
terms
is
of
very
energy
strong,
trade.
though.
And Egypt,
Right.
Egypt has a huge and growing demand for gas. That, they would really like to get some of it, but the politics are still very difficult, I think. And the priority, as far as he seemed to be concerned, for Israel and Israeli exports was exporting into the EU, and that's the thing which they're now very much focused on, is this pipeline idea under the Mediterranean, and that could obviously be a very important market for them, and also an important supplier for Europe.
Then the Chinese have been very interested in energy purchases, oil and natural gas, pipelines, Kazakhstan into China.
Yeah.
So it's global business.
We have one in the first row, please.
Yes, I'm curious if the U.S. would have a role in, or like an interest in keeping oil prices low to put more pressure on governments that may be adversary to us, like in Russia or in Iran.
That idea actually kind of came up during Ronald Reagan's presidency, and that was one of the thoughts behind some of the diplomacy that was going on then with Russia. I've heard suggestions that Saudi Arabia, which has grave concerns about Iran, and Russia's support for Iran is not particularly interested in seeing either one of those countries sell a lot of oil for a lot of money. So it's certainly possible. I think that ultimately, though, you get back to this question of what eventually drives it. Is it decisions like that get made by governments, or is it market forces that ultimately end up setting the price? And I'm inclined to think that you can have periods of time where policy decisions can impact pricing, higher or lower, but that ultimately it's the markets that drive the supply and the demand and the kind of fuels that we get.
And also, I guess the other thing, as we've been saying, it's a blunt instrument if you think about trying to use the oil weapon in that way in terms of wanting to see low prices, because it also hurts US allies like Saudi Arabia, like Iraq, like Nigeria, I mean, several other oil-producing countries. So it's a bit tricky, I think, to think of that as a tool of geopolitical influence.
Second row.
You hear a lot about impact to jobs as being one of the main reasons to, or one of the main lists in the con column for climate change investment, or in some cases even acknowledgement. Can you comment on the job impact or creation potential from fossil fuels versus renewables?
So jobs and fossil fuels, renewables. I think certainly if you're working for Tesla, you're probably making a pretty good wage. If you're installing solar panels on a roof somewhere, it might not really be that great of a job compared to working in the oil fields or working for an electric utility. So it's not just the number of jobs, it's the quality of the job, it's how much income it generates. One of the problems that I think we get into is trying to, count jobs and say green jobs are better than coal jobs, or now we have a president that's saying just the opposite. And I'm back to, why don't we let the markets sort this out and let the jobs go where the companies are earning returns that are generating the income that create the jobs and the income that goes with those jobs. Oil is a big part of the U.S. economy. Again, back to Leo's opening remarks, how lifestyles and health improved tremendously with the invention of the internal combustion engine and electricity back at the turn of the 1900s, and what we're doing now with, and then in the 20s and 30s with sewer and water, clean water, has made a huge difference, which I think people have lost sight of. The ability of us to enjoy the lifestyles that we have is largely dependent on, right now, fossil fuels. And we will eventually make a transition to something else. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take inventiveness and effort. And I think we've got to let that play out. If you go back to the whole jobs issue again, before we get all wound up on whether fossil fuels or green jobs are better, keep in mind that there are other pieces of the U.S. economy, healthcare, finance, and banking, broad financial activities, including all this, that are still contributing hugely to the U.S. economy. And making sure that that's growing too is very important. So I maybe Ed would like to take a crack.
Well, yeah, I mean, just as a kind of a factoid, it is the case there are a lot more people employed in renewable energy in this country than there are in coal. There's about 370,000 people working in solar power, about another 100,000 in wind, compared to 160,000 in the coal industry. That's between coal-fired power plants and coal mining and distribution together. But as Adam says, actually at the end of the day, that's not really what matters. What matters for employment and growth in the country is having the right macroeconomic policies, having the right tax policies, having the right regulatory policies in general, having a good quality education system. It's all that kind of stuff, and kind of thinking about things in a kind of micro way about this is a good thing because it creates one little pocket of jobs here is actually not generally a good way to run an economy and to make your economy more productive and efficient, however you do it, as you say, whether it's favoring green energy in that way or whether it's favoring fossil fuels. The things we should be thinking about in terms of investing in different types of energy is, as you say, what we get out of it, what the benefits are and what the costs are in terms of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, whatever else they might be. Those are the things really that are important. As if you think about this, if we were to all power our homes by having lots of people sitting on exercise bicycles and pedaling like mad to drive little dynamos, you could create a large number of jobs that way. That would not necessarily be a great way to run the economy. So, as I say, it's those considerations really that I think are worth thinking about more.
We'd be more in shape, though. Third row, please.
Given the current philosophy in Washington and acknowledging that the venture capital community has invested a lot in energy alternatives over the last, say, 2 decades, some of that technology has been amazing, but it's a long haul, and it's drying up. The source of that capital is drying up. Conversely, the oil companies have been investors in some of those companies on a minority basis. Do you see them stepping up, acquiring these companies and further commercializing the technology? Or who's gonna step up? What incentives will be made to step up to accomplish continuation of these inventions?
A very interesting question. What I go to usually is the fact that oil companies have a very bad record of investing in these kind of technologies. If you look down the years, I mean, you think sort of BP notoriously, do you remember the whole Beyond Petroleum thing? It wasn't a complete disaster, and actually some things they've got still a very successful wind business in the US, but a lot of that flopped. I think they've wrote off about half the money they invested in that. And so when you see oil companies investing in these kind of technologies, my instinct is always to be extremely skeptical of them. And partly it's just because it's beyond their area of expertise. Generally, they know what they know, large-scale engineering, they know geology, they know an enormous amount about reservoir management, you know, how fluids flow around a system, that kind of thing. Often those skills are difficult to transfer to renewable technology, different kinds of innovative technologies. So the question then is, if not the oil companies, then who? And I think that's a difficult question to answer. And as you say, there's a lot of money has been burned and a lot of people have been unsuccessful with venture capital investments in new clean technologies. And actually, if you look at the amount of money that's been flowing in recent years, it's kind of stalled. And you could certainly say we're not putting nearly enough money into developing those kind of new energy breakthroughs of the future. But I don't believe, whatever the answer is, I don't believe it's the big oil companies.
So one of the interesting unintended consequences of oil prices being $50 instead of 100 or 150 is that it makes it harder to raise money for alternatives to fossil fuels. And that was a big fear, I think, of the environmental community is even with hydraulic fracturing and the success that we've seen in natural gas. Yes, natural gas has done a lot to lower carbon emissions in the U.S. as we've substituted natural gas for coal. But that to the environmental community, that's not a long-term solution. And the availability of lower priced fossil fuels is just kind of prolonging the agony in their view and how you get the venture capital in there. So let me throw a plug in for something that I think could be very important. Brian Hansen and I were talking earlier today about the role of the federal labs. So the federal government has a number of laboratories across the country. There's one right here in Chicago, Argonne Lab, that's been working on battery technology, just as an example. And there's the NREL lab out in Boulder, Colorado that works on renewables. There's the NETL lab in West Virginia and Pittsburgh that works on fossil fuels, trying to find clever new ways of doing things better. And I'm, my vote would be that finding a way to keep that level of federal investment in research and development going when the private sector might not actually be the easiest place to raise money for it is something that would be really useful. And so I'd like to see that happen. I mean, there's plenty of things that I would like to, because we're all faced with our, we want to spend a lot more money than we have income to support the spending.
And actually, of course, when you look back at history, government support for innovation has been enormously important in driving energy breakthroughs. If you look at nuclear, if you look at unconventional gas, you look at solar power, all these things, government has played a critical role in the early stages in getting those technologies advanced, doing some of that critical R&D.
Right, and we are just now actually about a year away, I think, from the completion of a project that's been underway for a couple of decades, a fusion research that is being supported by the U.S., France, Germany, even the Russians are involved in this. And, you know, we could all hope that something like that could come in and really lower the costs. I mean, you know, we're back to the battery storage. Somebody needs to figure out a way how to store as much energy in a battery as you can put in a gasoline tank. We haven't figured that out yet.
We'll take another question from online. This is interesting and voted very well. Do you think we should be valuing the externalities of oil and gas, i.e. health, environment for the health, environment, in setting policy?
Should we be finding a way to, well, yes, I mean, anybody that believes in economics, in fact, that's a really interesting thing about the role of government. The proper role of government in the minds of many people is not minimizing government or like not having government at all, but it's having government step in and take care of those things that can't be done by the private sector or where the private sector fails. You know, the obvious examples are defense. We can't have, you know, 50 states and a bunch of territories all having their own armies to guard our borders and take care of us, right? That's an obvious one. Another one might be what we were just talking about, spending some federal taxpayer money on innovative research and development ideas in the federal labs. So the way that question came in, it was not quite this, but well, why don't we have a carbon tax? A lot of people are talking about that. So if you say, well, we have an administration now that doesn't see carbon as being a problem, and taxes are always a problem for anybody. You know, but you could go back and you could say, look, we do know that there are a lot of problems associated with fossil fuels that have nothing to do with carbon dioxide. It's sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides and particulate matter and heavy metal concentrations. And, you know, like, I mean, really, when you get right down to it, if you were in India right now and you said, how worried are you about carbon dioxide? They would probably say, not too much. How worried are you about mercury pollution in the water or in the air? They would probably say, yeah, that's a problem. I've seen what that can do for birth defects and other issues associated with that. So maybe we could get a twofer. Maybe if we somehow had a carbon tax that helped us raise the money for the R&D and renewable research that we want to do and took care of I think what Ed called smoke, that would be like something that we could agree on. There is actually a Republican proposal to go for a carbon tax. Exxon Mobil has talked about a carbon tax. A lot of the oil companies have talked about doing that. The coal industry is not so big on the idea.
I think I called it smog. That's probably just my accent.
Smog.
I mean, yeah, the way I always think about this is just as a kind of a basic intuition. If you tax something, you get less of it. And so why we tax wages and profits and we don't tax pollution seems crazy.
I'm with you on that, but I've never had to run for office.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have, so please join me in thanking our speakers for tonight.
Sebastian, thank you very much, and Ed, thank you. And I saw a couple of hands that people that really wanted to ask a question. Ed and I will stand up here for a while and see if we can help you out.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.